everyone. This is our Ponty reading group. We're continuing our reading of the structure of behavior. The page where we're picking up is I'm not 100% sure because of some technical issues, but I think we're on page 62 of the translation. So we skipped chapter 1. If you're following along, we read the introduction and then we skipped chapter 1 and then we started into chapter 2 and we're I believe in the second section of that chapter. So the last couple sessions, we looked at this criticism of the reflex theory, of Pavlov's version of the reflex theory. And so sort of the brief version of the criticism is essentially that it doesn't really work. If you try to sort of assign quantities to the different reflexes that are supposed to combine together to produce complex behavior, it turns out that there's no set of quantities that makes a consistent, you can't solve the, sorry, just a sec. Sorry, don't know what that was. There's no consistent set of quantities you can assign to the variables that make all the equations true at the same time. So like certain reflexes or certain stimuli are excitatory, certain are inhibitory, but if you try to combine them together, you find that some have to be excitatory in certain combinations and inhibitory in other combinations. So you can't assign like a single quantity and say this stimulus has value 7 or -3 or whatever. And so the lesson that Merleau-Ponty draws from this is that the real stimulus, like what is actually sort of effective in the behavioral response of the organism, is the whole situation, the whole sort of structured stimulus, and not like a single sort of punctual stimulus. So instead of saying that like the light or the sound or the smell or whatever is a stimulus on its own, instead it's the whole combination, the whole situation where the organism is found. So the whole environment of light, sound, smell, everything all sort of working together at the same time. This whole complex structure acts as a whole on the organism and not as a sort of combination of simple elements. So that was the sort of criticism of the reflex theory that we saw in the previous section. And then in this section that we started, I think last session, he looks at the way that this theory is sort of connected with an account of localization in the brain. So the idea is that, again, if you have this kind of simple stimulus response structure of behavior, you would expect that you would likewise have a sort of simple localization in the brain, so that like one stimulus, say like a certain visual stimulus, a certain light in a region of the retina or whatever, this stimulus would affect one brain area, and that brain area would have an excitatory connection with other brain areas, or it would have inhibitory connections with certain other brain areas. And so the way that a certain type of stimulus affects behavior would be would correlate with a structure of localization in the brain. So yeah, you would have like a very simple kind of localization of like different types of stimulus would have different areas in the brain that correspond to them, and at the same time you would have like the type of response that is elicited by these stimuli would be determined by what kinds of connections those different brain areas have to each other. And this, turns out to be not entirely false. This is sort of an oversimplification, but there are what are called topographical maps in the cortex. So, for example, there's a motor map kind of representation. So like you're in motor areas of the cortex, there's a sort of distorted map of the human body with regions that are more flexible or have a greater variety of motor responses. Those regions are overrepresented in motor areas of the brain. So for example, like you see sometimes little diagrams of this in like neuroscience textbooks, and it looks like there's a human body, except like the hand, especially the right hand, is huge, or if we're a right-handed person, The right hand is huge because we have very fine motor control with our right hand and to a lesser extent left hand for right-handed people. And then regions that have limited motor flexibility, like say your lower back, are much less have a much smaller representation. So like your face and your tongue, especially your hand, all these regions are overrepresented. Sorry, would you mind just muting for a second if you're not speaking? There's some noise. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and so this sort of representation of like a simple correspondence between stimuli and brain areas is an oversimplification, but there are areas of the brain that correspond in relatively straightforward ways. Yeah, so there's the motor representation. There's also retinotopic maps, they're called. So like areas in the visual cortex that sort of corresponds to different regions of the retina. So that like light shining in region 1 will produce a response in a corresponding region in the visual cortex, and then in region 2 of the retina, it will produce a response in a second region of the visual cortex, and so on. So you can sort of draw a map of the retina on the visual cortex. So there are these sorts of relatively straightforward representations of the of stimuli in the functioning of the brain, but obviously the way that this is depicted in Pavlov is like an oversimplification. And so some of the what we're going to go through today, I think, is some of the ways in which this is an oversimplification. So some of the things that make the actual functioning of the cortex and the brain in general more complicated than just like a simple correspondence between the stimuli and brain regions. Yeah, so, and then Angus has put in the chat here about handedness and what this implies about habituation. Yeah, I guess the question here is sort of which comes first. So is it the fact that you use your right hand more that makes it that the area is larger, or is it the fact that the area is larger that makes you use your right hand more? I think, yeah, it's probably hard to give like a sort of linear causal account of this. There's probably a kind of feedback between like, I guess, some sort of like initial preference for the right hand, and then the fact that the right hand is preferred in terms of fine manipulation would in turn sort of reinforce the initial preference, and so you have the sort of circular causality where you have like the preference for the right hand makes it more likely to be used, and the fact that it's more likely to be used makes it more likely to be preferred in later use. So you would have like a constantly sort of expanding reinforcement of the of that right hand preference. But yeah, and I mean, just as a sort of aside, there's also like so brain regions that are connected to motor responses are sort of crossed. So like the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, and the right side of your brain controls the left side in most people. But left-handed people, some have like reversed sort of it's almost like a mirror image of a right-handed person. So like their left hand is controlled by the right side of their brain, and the left hand representation in the right side of the brain is like much bigger than the right hand representation on the left side of the brain. But there are other left-handed people that have like not just a sort of mirror image of a right-handed person, but like a completely different sort of architecture, I guess you could say, of like distribution of motor regions. So yeah, they don't have that same sort of dominance of one side over the other, for example. Anyway, it's just sort of an interesting, weird thing like that happens. Like and sort of the whole like evolutionary origin of handedness is also quite obscure. Like why is it that something like 90% of humans are right-handed, and then why would there be like 10% that are left-handed, and then out of that number, a certain proportion have this sort of non mirror architecture of the brain. So yeah, there's a lot of weird, not like things that haven't been explained yet. Yeah, and then there's that association of left-handedness with evil. I think the word sinister, for example, etymologically refers to the left-hand side, and then of course now has the connotation of evil. And I think this association of the left with evil is not limited to like Western culture. I think there are a lot of other cultures that make the same association. But yeah, anyway, there's a lot of like obscure and unexplained material about this whole handedness situation and this already sort of points to like the limitations of just seeing just trying to make this like one-to-one mapping between stimuli and brain areas that Pavlov is trying to do. Like just the fact that the right-hand side and the left-hand side have like very different valences for different people in terms of which side is dominant, and then how that dominant side relates to the less dominant side. Like all these things already show that there's more going on in the way that the brain is structured than just like particular stimuli corresponding to particular points of the cortex. Okay, so let's jump into the text for today. So if someone could read from the top of page 62, or the first full paragraph on 62.
I can read. Although the discussion remains open, both concerning the limits of this or that center and concerning the definition of mental functions to be localized in each particular case, agreement seems to have been established concerning the meaning of localizations in general, and concerning the significance of place in nerve substance. We would like to formulate some of the established results, since they will allow us to become acquainted with the quote-unquote central sector of behavior and to understand its insertion in the body. 1. A lesion, even localized. So I guess this is the first established result. A lesion, even localized, can determine structural disorders which concern the whole of behavior, and analogous structural disorders can be provoked by lesions situated in different regions of the cortex. The older theory of localizations underestimated two difficulties of fact, that of localizing the lesion and that of localizing the function, which Monaco has insisted upon, but also a third difficulty, that of defining the illness studied and the corresponding normal function, which difficulty could not be surmounted without a methodological reflection in a theory of biological knowledge. It has long been known that the constitution of quote-unquote nosological personalities, the discovery of the fundamental disorder from which the multiplicity of observable symptoms is derived, is a problem for pathology. But in general pathology, the symptoms are sometimes given unequivocally. Massive deficiencies are involved. Often the organism ceases responding to certain physicochemical excitations in all circumstances. The disorder affects real fragments of behavior. Or to be more exact, since it is the fundamental adaptations with regard to the vital milieu which are compromised, the solicitations of this milieu are ordinarily sufficient to reveal and characterize the illness. Thus, it will be possible rather often to define pathological behavior by means of a realistic analysis in which the characteristics conserved and those abolished are enumerated. In order to interrelate the symptoms and delimit a nosological entity, one will often be able to discover a real chain of effects and causes, observable in principle, which lead from the superficial manifestations to the essential disorder. The latter can then be designated as the causal origin of the illness. Thus, even if it alters the functioning of the entire organism, it has a defined site and can be localized on the map of the body. Carried over into mental pathology, this method of realistic analysis and causal explanation has led to defining aphasia, or more generally the agnosias, by certain circumscribed disorders, by the absence of certain contents of behavior. It was believed that the symptomatology of mental illness could also be content with noting deficiencies. It was not realized that the symptom is an organism's response to a question from the milieu, and that the tableau of symptoms varies then with the questions which are posed to the organism. The symptom always corresponds to an expectation of the mind, which expectation must be precise in order that the symptoms be significative. Taking over the confused classifications which are given in the language, the physician wondered only if the sick person could speak, understand, write, or read. The psychologists, on the other hand, although they had abandoned the quote-unquote faculty of speaking or the quote-unquote faculty of remembering, had limited themselves to giving the empiricist equivalents of these. The concrete act of speech or of reference to the past was reduced to the possession of certain specific contents of consciousness, to quote-unquote representations or quote-unquote images. Thus, aphasia and amnesia necessarily had to be defined from the beginning as the loss, or the loss of control, of certain collections of mental states. Physicians unknowingly singled out in the behavior of the aphasic that which could be interpreted as a disorder of the verbal images. If other symptoms presented themselves, they were either attributed to supplementary lesions, they were put aside as altering the quote-unquote purity of the case, or, since the observation of the patient almost always went beyond the theoretical framework of the illness, one sought to derive the disturbing symptoms from the quote-unquote primary disorders, paraphasia from psychic deafness, disorders of writing from the destruction or inefficacy of the quote-unquote verbal images. Maybe I'll stop there.
But I think it's a good place to stop. Yeah.
It seems like what he's setting up here is a rejection or a heavy qualification of this earlier understanding, which seems to be saying amounts to basically a kind of like faculty psychology, where you have this kind of predefined stock of behaviors which can be like knocked out by a lesion in a relatively discrete, like a lesion in a part of the brain that is associated with the faculty that is disturbed. And I think that the understanding of the effect of lesions that he's going to move towards is one in which there's this kind of overall and holistic functioning, which, while there is a kind of localization, it sort of becomes dimmer overall. And so like the finer aspects of perception or speaking are the more difficult and more difficult to control, or like more detailed figures that stand out from the ground start to disappear, as opposed to discrete faculty disappearing.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think so. One point here that he emphasizes is how these supposed faculties or these abilities that are supposed to be lost with a lesion of a certain area of the brain are sort of common sense ideas of like everyone sort of knows what it means to be able to speak or to be able to remember, etc. And then this person who has suffered an injury to the brain, in sort of a common sense or obvious sense, is unable to speak. And so you say, okay, well, this injury must have destroyed the faculty of speech or the ability to speak. And even if you sort of translate these faculties into supposedly more scientific terms, and you say something like, it destroyed the representations of speech sounds or something like that, you're still essentially just using these common sense ideas of like, what abilities a sort of normal or average human being has. You're just sort of translating these common sense terms into like more scientific terms, but you're not really doing more of a fine-grained analysis of the behavior. And so what he will talk about, I think, later is how, like, when you look at the speech of someone or the attempts at speech of someone who has suffered a brain injury, it's not just that there's like there's not sort of an on and off switch of like a normal person is able to speak and then this injury happens to their brain and then they're unable to speak. Instead, you find various ways in which speech is disordered. It could be the actual articulation movements, so like movements of the tongue and other parts of the mouth that are required to produce speech sounds that could be disturbed in such a way that they're unable to pronounce the sounds of speech, but they might still be able to write normally and to understand spoken language normally. So that's one possibility. Or it could be that like syntax is disturbed, like they can produce all the sounds and they can pronounce individual words, but when they try to put them together into a sentence, it doesn't make any sense, or like the sort of grammatical structure of a sentence doesn't work. So you can imagine like a variety of different ways in which speech could be disturbed. And so when you just say that the patient is unable to speak, like this very sort of superficial description of the of what has changed after the injury doesn't really capture the detail of like what exactly is disturbed in the patient's attempt to speak. And then the other sort of element of this is that this description, like the patient is unable to speak, is a sort of like deficiency model of what has happened. So it's like, as you said, there's sort of like a stock of faculties or abilities that a person has before the injury, and then the lesion occurs to a certain area of the brain, and then one of those faculties disappears or is destroyed or whatever. So like the patient after the lesion is like sort of represented as being the same as they were before the lesion, except minus one or several of the faculties that they had previously. Whereas if you sort of analyze things in a more fine-grained way and without this sort of presupposition of a like fixed stock of faculties, you find instead that the behavior of the patient after the lesion is still in some way an attempt to cope with the environment, to respond to what possibilities the environment offers and make appropriate actions, except that it has to, because of the lesion, it has to be performed in a very different way. And so so like, for example, in the case of a stroke, so a stroke is often involves a very localized lesion. So a particular blood vessel in the brain bursts and damages a certain area of the brain. And you might lose, for example, the ability to pronounce words, as a result of this lesion in the brain. But then after weeks or months, you might regain some of that function. You might have, still some difficulty speaking, and there might be some slurring, for example, but you regain at least partially the ability to articulate words. And so what this sort of shows is that this ability to articulate words can't be like sort of localized in a very simple way, as like this region of the brain controls the articulation of words, and no other region of the brain is involved. Instead, we find that the person as a sort of whole organism, as a an entity that is trying to perform actions that are appropriate to a particular setting, is able to accommodate to restrictions like those brought about by lesions to achieve a certain goal, even if it's not quite as effective or not done in the same way as it would normally be done. But there's a response of the whole organism to the situation, as opposed to like a very sort of simplistic idea that there's like one faculty or one ability that is just sort of deleted from the organism. So this is like the other aspect is the whole organism response, as opposed to just one ability that is destroyed by the lesion. And so what this means for localization is that like if that very simplistic picture were accurate, then you could just look at like people that had suffered these various brain injuries and identify what faculties or abilities they were missing, and then say, okay, the injury destroyed the faculty of speech, or maybe a more precise one like the articulation of words. Therefore, the injury to this area, so the injury to this area destroyed this faculty. Therefore, that area was responsible for that faculty, or controlled that faculty, or whatever. But because things don't actually work out in this very simplistic way, it's much harder to say that one area of the brain has this like sort of common sense description of what it does, and this like is borne out to some extent, at least in more recent research on brain functioning using like fMRI, for example. It turns out that even something that seems in some ways like a very coherent and sort of cohesive ability, like speaking, involves a variety of different brain areas. There's not like one area that's sort of like the speech area. There are a variety of areas that are all involved in producing speech, and there's also flexibility in recovery from damage, at least to some extent. You can, like I mentioned earlier, after a stroke, you can recover the ability to articulate, maybe not perfectly, but you can actually produce understandable sounds. So yeah, you can learn how to like. There's what's called plasticity in the brain, meaning that different areas can be involved in different processes and after learning or habituation. So what normally would have been done by area 1 could, after an injury to area 1, instead be done by area 2. And so all of these facts just make it much harder to say that there's like a sort of correspondence between function and area of the brain. And this is what localization would, if it were effective, is what it would do. It would be to make that correspondence. So yeah, the localization turns out to be much more complicated than anyone had sort of expected in the early 20th century.
Makes me think of what we talked about with respect to embryo development and how removing a portion of the embryo won't result in, if it's done at an early enough stage in development, won't result in like a chicken that's missing a leg, for instance. It will just result in an overall smaller organism. Seems like something similar is going on here.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good comparison, because in both cases we have some sort of holistic structure. What exactly that means is difficult to pin down, but in each case we have an organism as a whole that the whole as such has some sort of effect on the development of all the parts, as opposed to each individual part sort of having its own simple contribution, and then each part just sort of adding up its contribution to the effect of the whole. So, like in the case of the embryo, it's the structure of an adult organ, or of the newly hatched chick, for example. There's something that in the development of the embryo sort of directs the development towards something like the newly hatched chick, and this is, at least to some extent, capable of sort of reorganizing the development structure, the development process, so that if it is disturbed at an early enough stage, it will still develop into a normal chick. And then likewise, in the case of behavior, if there's a sort of normal process of the way that the brain is involved in governing behavior or controlling behavior, but if that's disturbed in some sense, it's, again, depending on the degree and the type of lesion, for example, but in certain cases, at least, it's possible to sort of restructure behavior to produce a similar effect as in the normal case or the uninjured case. So here, like the sort of goal, the target of producing a kind of behavior that's appropriate to a given situation seems to be in some way controlling the process through which the different parts bring about that behavior itself. So so it's holistic in the sense that the actual whole organism is, at least at one level of description, is controlling the operation of the parts that make up that whole. And so this is a very different type of sort of interaction or developmental process than just thinking of an organism as made up of simple components that each contribute a particular sum, a particular quantity towards the functioning of the whole organism. And this was also, like, again, this sort of embryology was one area, but then also, like, in connection with behavior, where there was this debate in the early 20th century between vitalists and mechanists. And so the mechanists, so Pavlov, for example, was a mechanist in this sense, in that he wants to explain complex behavior in terms of simple components that each add up to produce the complex effect. And then in embryology, if you, for example, tried to explain the development of an embryo in terms of how each portion of the embryo, given its chemical composition and so on, how they all sort of bring about the process through which the normal like the chick in the case of a chicken develops out of the embryo. So this would be a sort of mechanistic explanation. It only appeals to mechanical causes. And then the vitalists in general there's a sort of negative sense of vitalism in just saying that the mechanical causes are insufficient to explain these types of phenomena. And then like the sort of positive side of vitalism is generally much more obscure, but often they would appeal to notions like a vital force, or entelechy was a term that was used in early 20th century embryology. Some sort of notion of something other than mechanical causation as being involved in governing these processes. And then the objection to vitalism is always that this kind of other than mechanical causation is just sort of a verbal explanation as opposed to a real scientific explanation. Like if you just say, oh, there's a vital force that governs the development of the embryo, you can explain anything just by saying there's a vital force that controls it, and so you haven't really explained anything in that sense. So yeah, the sort of negative side of vitalism, the criticism of existing mechanical explanations and saying that mechanical explanation is insufficient to explain a certain phenomenon. This negative side is, I think, much more effective than sort of the positive side of saying actually there's this vital force or whatever. Even if you reject that idea that positing a vital force is an actual scientific explanation, you can still hold on to that negative side of vitalism and say that this mechanical explanation is not sufficient to account for whether it's the development of an embryo or goal-directed behavior in an organism, any sort of phenomenon that you think is not explicable in purely mechanical terms. So yeah, you can sort of hold on to that negative side of vitalism without actually accepting the sort of positive side. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. I can read the next page or so. The force of the facts and the contradictions of theory have obliged psychology and physiology to become aware of the postulates which had guided them in the classical conception of localizations. Like the philosophy of faculties, the theory of verbal images was at the same time realistic, since it analyzed acts into real fragments, and abstract, since it isolated them from their context. The anatomical spirit sought to actualize nerve functioning in visible connections and circumscribed areas. Modern investigations, on the contrary, proceed by concrete description and ideal analysis. Cortical lesions rarely give rise to elective disorders involving certain fragments of normal behavior in isolation. Ordinarily, the organism does not become purely and simply indifferent to certain sectors of the physical-chemical milieu, and does not lose the aptitude for executing a certain number of movements. It is known that the aphasic or apraxic subject is capable or incapable of certain verbal or real actions depending on whether the latter are situated in a concrete and affective context or whether, on the contrary, they are quote-unquote gratuitous. In certain amnesic aphasias, observation shows that the subject has not, properly speaking, lost the words which he remains capable of employing in automatic language. He has lost the power of naming because, in the act of denomination, the object and the word are taken as representatives of a category and are thus considered from a certain quote-unquote point of view, chosen by the one who names. This quote-unquote categorial attitude is no longer possible in a subject reduced to concrete and immediate experience. What is inaccessible is not then a certain stock of movements, but a certain type of acts, a certain level of action. As a consequence, we can understand why the disorder is not limited to a particular faculty, but is discovered in varying degrees in all those which demand the same attitude of gratuitousness. Quote, each problem which forces the patient beyond the sphere of immediate reality to that of the quote possible or to the sphere of representation ensures his failure. End quote. This happens whether it is a question of action, perception, will, feeling, or language. Thus, a specific disorder should always be put back into the context of the total behavior. From this point of view, a comparison becomes possible between the picture presented by aphasia and that by other illnesses. It is always a question, in some measure, of the deficiency of a fundamental function, which Gelb and Goldstein call categorial attitude. head power of symbolic expression, and mediation function, darstellende Funktion. Since the behavior of the patient adheres much more closely to the concrete and immediate relations of the milieu than the behavior of the normal person, the fundamental disorder could also be defined as, quote, the impairment of the capacity to comprehend the essential features of an event, unquote, or finally, as the incapacity of clearly disengaging a perceived, conceived, or exercised grouping as a figure from a ground treated as indifferent. Pathological transformation takes place in the direction of a less differentiated, less organized, more global, and more amorphous behavior. It may happen in alexia that the patient can read his name as a word, but not the letters which compose it taken separately. In motor aphasia, that he can pronounce a word inserted in a verbal ensemble, but not if it is isolated. In hemiplegia, the global movements, the quote-unquote legato, sometimes remain possible while the detailed movements, the quote-unquote staccato, are compromised. It is evident that here the sickness does not directly concern the content of behavior, but rather its structure, and consequently that it is not something which is observed, but rather something which is understood. The conduct of the patient is not deduced from the conduct of the normal person by simple subtraction of parts. It represents a qualitative alteration, and it is to the extent that certain actions demand an attitude of which the subject is no longer capable that they are electively disordered. There appears here a new kind of analysis which no longer consists in isolating elements but in understanding the character of a whole and its immanent law. Sickness is no longer, according to the common representation, like a thing or a power from which certain effects follow, nor is pathological functioning, according to a too widespread idea, homogeneous with normal functioning. It is a new signification of behavior, common to the multitude of symptoms, and the relation of the essential disorder to the symptoms is no longer that of cause to effect, but rather the logical relation of principle to consequence or of signification to sign. Right, so this is sort of the summary or the moral of what we were talking about earlier, right? So when you look at a person who has suffered a lesion or a neurological illness of some kind, you can't just say, you can't just say their behavior is a normal person's behavior or an uninjured person's behavior minus function X. You can't just sort of subtract a certain function from their behavior and say that's what the lesion has brought about. You instead have to look at the way that the whole sort of structure of the behavior of the organism has been modified by the lesion. And in general, like this is a sort of generalization that he points to here, you can often see that what is disordered is the capacity to perform an action separate from the normal context in which it occurs. So sometimes, like one example that I remember reading about, not in this book, but in much later studies, there was a patient who had suffered some sort of brain lesion, and the experimental task or the task that they were trying to study was to match the angle of a slot. Take a piece of paper or whatever and stick it, make it match the angle of a slot in a wall or in a box or whatever. And the patient wasn't able to do this. They couldn't sort of match the paper to the angle of the slot. But if you instead gave them a letter and said, put the letter in the slot, they were able to do it. So in this case, the sort of goal-directed behavior of putting a letter through a slot, that is something that the patient could accomplish. But then the sort of abstract behavior of like match this angle to the other angle, which has no sort of obvious goal-directedness, this behavior the patient was not able to accomplish. And even though in terms of like the actual physical movements of your hand and so on, the movements are the same. So if you just sort of looked at the patient in terms of like, can they match this angle? You would say, okay, this like sort of coordination of visual perception of an angle and motor responses of the hands is deficient. Like they lack this capacity that uninjured patients have or uninjured people have. But then when you see the patient, mailing a letter or performing the action of mailing a letter, you would say, oh, they actually do have this capacity. So you can't just sort of in the abstract say that there's this capacity that's missing. What instead seems to be missing is something like the capacity to isolate a particular behavior or a particular set of actions from a setting to perform these actions sort of gratuitously is the word that he uses here. So like without a particular goal. And so this is something that happens in many cases, probably not all cases, but many cases of injury, is that the sort of more coordinated or larger structure survives, and then the isolated element doesn't survive or is much more disturbed. And like there's other cases, for example, of aphasics who are capable of singing. They can sing a song and articulate words while they're singing. But then if you ask them to like repeat the words just spoken, they are unable to do it, or they if they try to do it, it's very disturbed and hard to understand. So here somehow the sort of coordination of the elements survives better than the elements themselves, which is obviously sort of the opposite of what you would expect from a very simple localization theory. So again, the sort of lesson to draw here is that our understanding of behavior has to be in terms of these much larger structures, as opposed to like individual simple elements that are then combined together to form complex wholes.
I thought it was interesting, this part at the top of page 64 where he talks about how aphasics are, I think it's 64. Yeah, the loss of this kind of categorical attitude, or it's almost like a symbolic function where the word is representative of a category, sort of makes it sound like aphasia as kind of like moving down like Hegel's ladder in the phenomenology towards sense certainty, or like the loss of the ability of the what Kant would assign to the understanding.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting comparison. I think so. This idea of like a categorical attitude, I think the idea here is that like when you treat a name sort of in isolation, when you just sort of like point to an object and say, "What is this?" There's no like real goal directedness, or you don't understand necessarily if you're just a patient or a subject in a psychological experiment, and the experimenter just sort of points to an object and asks you to name it. The purpose of this whole operation is obscure, and like you don't really understand like what's the point of naming this object, or what is the purpose of using this word. And so like obviously for most people we're still able to actually recall the name of the object and apply it to the object that the experimenter is pointing to. Like we can just sort of perform this naming action without having any like concrete goal in mind or understanding what the purpose is. But these aphasic patients, however what exactly the sort of mechanism is, but for whatever reason, they are unable to perform this kind of abstract naming operation. So they can use a word, like they might be able to use complex expressions like pass the salt or whatever, when there's like a goal in mind. But if you point towards a salt shaker and ask them, what is this, they might not be able to recall the word salt or to use the word salt in this context, or sort of outside of the context of a goal. So it's this sort of abstract use of a name just as like a pure symbol of a type of object or a category of object. I think that's what he has in mind here. This is a sort of arbitrary, like this is a sort of a key notion in linguistics, is that any of these names that we use are arbitrary in the sense that every language has a completely different word, or very different words that are used to symbolize particular categories of objects or entities. And so there's no sort of intrinsic connection between the name and the category of objects. And so this sort of arbitrary connection seems to be what is hard for these aphasics to grasp. But instead, when they have like a connection between some sort of verbal behavior, even if it is a more complex one, and some sort of goal, that connection is experienced not as just a sort of arbitrary naming, but instead as a kind of means-end connection, that like if I produce this kind of verbal behavior, I can bring about this type of end, or this type of goal that I'm trying to achieve. So it's that arbitrary naming function of just applying a symbol to a category of entities that seems to be disturbed, at least in this class of aphasics. It's probably not possible to generalize this to all aphasics, but like at least a certain category of aphasics have this difficulty with this arbitrary naming function. And so I think that's what he means here by this categorial attitude. I also want to take the opportunity to point out how great it is that there's a neuroscientist named Head. There was also one in the early 20th century named Brain, which I think is incredible. Um, like, if you wrote a TV show where you had a neuroscientist named Brain, you would say that's like stupid and like, too obvious, but it's real. But yeah, that's just a aside. I think we can go on to the next bit. So we can start from the bit that's in small type on page 65, if someone would like to read.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can read. We're on, okay. The works of Gelb and Goldstein bring to light very clearly the structural character of disorders following cortical lesions and justify the idea of a comparison between different cerebral maladies. They find in a war-wounded man, Schneider, designated by his initial in their works, disorders which at the same time involve perception, visual recognition, and memory. The spatiality of tactile givens and tactile recognition, motor reactions. The patient is incapable of initiating or accomplishing a movement with his eyes closed. And finally, memory, intelligence, and language. For this patient, classical conceptions would authorize a diagnosis of psychic blindness, astereognosis, and disorders of intelligence with diffuse lesions of different parts of the brain all at the same time. But it is a question of a man wounded in the war who seems to present a unique lesion caused by a piece of shell. Moreover, the integrity of feeling and of elementary motor reactions and the normal appearance of bodily and mental behavior in practical living makes the hypothesis of multiple lesions most unlikely. The disorders have a systematic character, but it appears impossible to derive these different deficiencies from one of them. For example, from the disorder of visual perception, which had been observed first, and to which an unwarranted weight had been given as a consequence. All the deficiencies seem to express a fundamental alteration of behavior. Quote, the patient failed whenever it was necessary in order to react correctly to possess a given all at once as an articulated whole, while he acted quickly and happily each time a successive process was sufficient for the accomplishment of his task. Unquote. Thus, we find ourselves in the presence of a disorder of structure determined by a circumscribed lesion. This correlation had already been observed by Head, who considered it a general law of nerve functioning. Goldstein himself compares the observation we have just summarized to those which other authors have presented and which this time are concerned with aphasics. The patient studied by Buhlmann and Grunbaum presents disorders which at first glance are rather different from those of S. Gelb and Goldstein's patient sometimes recognized an object from certain characteristic details in spite of his visual disorders. For example, a die with certain black dots marked on it. On the contrary, Baumann and Grunbaum's subject did not perceive details, and these authors concluded from this that no rapprochement could be made between the two cases. But in reality, even though it may happen that S is troubled by details which are too precise, he is, for example, incapable of recognizing a quote-unquote bad circle in a badly drawn circle. This is always because his perception is not directed toward the essential. The incapacity of surmounting details and the incapacity of perceiving any at all are in reality disorders of the same form. In the two cases, we are equally removed from the organized perception of the normal person, who is capable of seizing wholes without their being confused, and of bringing to light details when they have a signification. The two patients present the same fundamental deficiency of the, quote, figure and ground structure, unquote. With S, the details are not chosen as essential and integrated into a whole. They are not properly perceived. Even though he recognizes an object by its height and its width, these properties are not apprehended directly, but reconstructed and deduced from certain confused signs. Thus, in reality, there are only superficial differences between the perceptive disorders in Gelb and Goldstein's subject and in Baumann and Grunbaum's. Moreover, the latter presents disorders of attention, thought, spontaneous language, denomination, and articulation, form of which is common and similar to that of the disorders of S. In all of these domains, quote, the mental or psychomotor process is fixated at a primitive phase of development, which goes from an impression of an amorphous whole to a more differentiated structuration, Ausgestaltung, unquote. Yeah, so this seems to be his broader thesis here, which is that these lesions, rather than being, although he'll qualify this a little bit later, rather than being sort of localizable, they lead to these structural deficiencies, so that details don't stand out because there is this kind of inability to form the background structure against which they would be significant details.
Yeah, so there's sort of like opposite, like the same sort of deficiency here has like opposite effects in these two different patients. So the one patient is sort of unable to recognize any details, and then the other patient like focuses on the details and is unable to sort of recognize the whole. But what in each case, what the sort of underlying deficiency that Merleau-Ponty is sort of diagnosing here is precisely the ability to connect the details with the whole in sort of an appropriate way. So like a person without any lesions, or a quote unquote normal person, will look at the picture and will be able to identify which details are important and which ones are sort of trivial, and sort of identify the important ones and focus on those ones, and then ignore the other details that don't matter. Whereas these two patients have sort of, because they can't identify important details and then sort of separate them from the background of all the other details that don't matter, they sort of lean in opposite directions, where one sort of focuses only on the details to the exclusion of the whole, and then the other one focuses on the whole to the exclusion of the details. But the sort of underlying cause of each side of this deficiency is the same in both cases. So like most of us, if you see a die, you recognize sort of all at once. You recognize it's a cubical shape and it has a certain pattern of dots, and like you just sort of recognize the image of a die very easily. Whereas one of these patients would sort of observe a bunch of dots and then sort of deduce, oh, this must be a die. Whereas the other patient would observe like this cubical form and sort of deduce, maybe it's a cube of some kind, maybe it's a block, maybe it's a die, like something like that. But in each case, they have to sort of perform a kind of reasoning process, or like a second step that most of us don't have to at least consciously go through. They have to sort of think about like what sort of thing could this be that's being presented to me. Either they look at the like overall size and shape, and then they try to deduce what kinds of objects have this type of size, and then conclude what it might be. Or they look, the other side is like this one patient who looks at the details and says like, okay, this is an object that has dots on it, so therefore it must be a die. But yeah, in each case, this sort of overall grasp of a pattern that all of us would normally be able to grasp, the fact that it's a cube with dots on it, and therefore it's a die, this overall pattern is something that they're unable to grasp. And so, yeah, it's this deficiency of isolating the figure from the ground is sort of like the abstract characterization of what is missing in these patients, as opposed to saying that there's this sort of very discrete, faculty of speech or something like that would be missing. And so this deficiency is a kind of, it's an overall incapacity to grasp a structure in experience and behavior, as opposed to the inability to respond to a particular kind of stimulus. And this is also why, like, he lists all the different deficiencies that S has, memory, reading, speech, etc., all these different things. And if you sort of assumed that each of these faculties corresponded to a particular brain area, you would have to say, this person has a lesion or has multiple lesions in each of these areas. He must have suffered injuries that affect like many different areas of the brain. But the argument here is that because all of these deficiencies share the same structure of this figure ground, this incapacity to grasp the figure ground distinction, because of this, we can conclude that it's not the case that there's like this sort of multiple lesions. It's actually overall this capacity to separate figure from ground that is deficient, and not just a sort of list of faculties that have been injured. And if we want to think maybe more generally about this figure ground distinction, and I think this will come up later in the book, but like isolating figure from ground is a sort of essential biological function, right? Like any organism has to figure out what elements of the environment are important, like are they, which elements show the presence of food or of a predator or of a potential mate, etc., and which other elements of the environment are sort of useless information that I can ignore. So like any organism has to respond to certain elements of the environment or certain information coming in and ignore other information coming in. And so what this deficiency of separating figure from ground shows is a kind of deficiency of vital response of the organism as a whole, as opposed to a loss of any like sort of isolated function. And so the injury to this particular portion of the brain, it has particular effects based on how those different elements or different portions of the brain are involved in different behaviors. But it also affects the sort of overall adaptation of the person to their environment. And so the person finds themselves sort of incapable of responding appropriately to the environment by figuring out or isolating the elements that are important in a given situation and the elements that are less important or that can be ignored in that situation. And so, yeah, like in this, given this kind of incapacity to isolate what's important, you can either like focus on whatever detail happens to sort of strike your attention first, and then sort of get stuck on that detail just in case it's important, not wanting to miss something important. Or you can like sort of stay at the level of general impressions of like the sort of vague total shape of an object that's presented to you, or size of the object, because you know that the details or that a lot of the details will not be important. So either response is it sort of makes sense, but it's a pathological response because you're not able to respond in an appropriate way to different situations. You have to sort of make do with this very elaborate and complicated sort of process of inference by like, okay, this object has a certain size, and I recognize that certain objects of this category have that size, so therefore it might be an object of that category. So yeah, it's a kind of workaround to try to react to the situation in an appropriate way, but without having the sort of regular capacity to grasp the what type of situation it is that you're presented with and what the appropriate response is. So it's a workaround to find that appropriate response without having that capacity to grasp the situation as a whole.
I have a somewhat tangential comment, but I was reading a little bit this week about kind of the trajectory of Merleau-Ponty's thought, and as I understand it, I think his next major work is Phenomenology of Perception, and it seems like he moves in a more transcendental and like phenomenological in the traditional sense direction in that work. But I bring that up because this idea of figure and ground, I understand he's talking about like perceptual structure here, but with a more kind of transcendental inflection, I think it would be an interesting way to think about structuralist philosophy in terms of this Gestalt distinction and structure of sense that is the background against which figures sort of become meaningful, in addition to, I guess, seeing it in this more psychologistic way. I don't know if Merleau-Ponty ever explicitly wrote about what he thought about structuralism or any possible connection with structuralism, but I think it's kind of could be an interesting connection.
Yeah, I think he does talk about structuralism in he has a book, Sense and Nonsense. I think it's a collection of papers. I read it years ago, so I don't remember much about it. But yeah, I think in general, I would say that structuralism, I mean, obviously there's a lot of different sort of approaches that all fall under in some, or that can all be sort of described as structuralist. And a lot of the people who are commonly described as structuralists would deny being structuralists or that there is such a thing as structuralism. So it's a kind of nebulous category. But one sort of aspect that they tend to share is an idea of analyzing structure as opposed to taking structure to be holistic in the sense that Merleau-Ponty wants to do it in this book, at least. So there's like, in this book, we have this notion of structure. Like later in the book, he'll talk about melodic structure, and I think he's already used this term a little bit earlier. But like the sort of general idea here is that when we hear a melody or when we remember a melody, we can't sort of reduce this experience to just a sequence of individual experiences of hearing tones, even though the melody is composed of tone A followed by tone B, etc. We can't just combine each of these individual isolated experiences. We have to somehow have a grasp of the melody as a whole, or of the sequence of tones as a structure, and then the individual tones that make up the melody sort of fit into that structure. But what structuralism would do, and sort of in response to something like this, would be to try to analyze what are the oppositions of elements that make up that structure of the melody. So, for example, you would want to identify the set of tones that make up the tone system of a musical tradition. Like in our Western tradition, we have a 12-tone, a system of 12 tones that can be used to make up a melody, for example. And then you would say, like, which of these oppositions or which sequences of tones out of this set of tones constitute like possible melodic sequences, for example. Obviously, you'd have to do a much more complicated analysis than that because it depends on the harmonic environment and so on. But that would be sort of like the oversimplified way of doing a structuralist analysis. So you would start from this set of oppositions between the possible elements that might appear in a particular position. So any of these 12 possible tones. So starting from that set of oppositions, then you would try to analyze a melody in terms of those oppositions, as opposed to sort of grasping a melody as a sort of intrinsic whole, which can't be isolated, at least in principle, can't be broken down into isolated elements. So yeah, I think structuralism in some sense is holistic in the sense that it has to do with this whole set of oppositions, but it's also in a different way than like Pavlov. It's also it also has to do with elements because it looks at each of these individual tones, for example, as an element. But what's different here is that each of these elements only is what it is in opposition to the other 11. It's not that each tone has like a simple response that it elicits in the organism. It's the fact that it's this tone and not this other tone or one of the 11 other possible tones. It's this opposition property that each of the tones has in relation to the others that makes it part of a musical system. But yeah, so Merleau-Ponty will talk about, and I think actually in Phenomenology of Behavior, he might, if I remember correctly, or Phenomenology of Perception, I mean, he might talk about structuralism to some extent there as well. I can't remember, but anyway, he does talk about structuralism in a few places. But yeah, I think he's sort of doing something different than this sort of structuralism that thinks in terms of oppositions of potential elements of a structure. I'm just sort of looking ahead. Yeah, we got a couple more pages of this section and small type. I wonder if maybe this would be a good place to stop for today, or we can go ahead. I don't know what people think.
I would not mind stopping a bit early today. I'm a bit tired tonight.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I know it's late for you. Okay, yeah, so let's stop here, and we'll continue with this small type. It's kind of a weird. It's I don't know why they kept this in the translation, but like these books from Presse Universitaire de France, they always have like sections in small type, which I think were just like a typographical sort of convenience. Like people were trying to fit in as much content as they could in a limit of a certain number of pages. I don't think it has any like real significance in terms of like the importance of these sections or whatever. But yeah, so it's probably not. It probably didn't need to be kept in the translation, but I guess it's better to keep than not to keep.
Yeah, I was wondering what that was. At first, I thought it was like quoted sections, but it's obviously not true.
Yeah, I think it's just like just fitting as much text as possible into a page restriction. Okay, so let me stop the bot.